Not all that glitters is gold, especially when it blinds you to the truth hidden in plain sight, yet unnoticed, often lies just beneath the surface. It was a Monday morning when the rain fell steady on the city, that typical gray morning that makes the world feel silent and insulated, as if every sound is muted and every color washed out. From the outside, Westwick Solutions, a gleaming skyscraper in the heart of the city, appeared just like every other corporate giant, polished, gleaming, and brimming with the promise of success. This company, built on years of strategy, ambition, and hard work, stood as a testament to the heights people will go to pursue their dreams. Inside, the hum of productivity echoed down long corridors, past sleek office furniture, and through conference rooms where deals were made, ideas discussed, and ambitions nurtured. But the story you're about to hear has little to do with ambition or success. Instead, it's a tale of human nature, of those traits we hide from each other, and sometimes even from ourselves. A story of perception and reality, of authority and respect. Within these walls, under the fluorescent lights and the careful polish, lay a story far darker than anyone could see at first glance. It all began the day our main character, let's call him Thomas, stepped into the offices of Westwick Solutions for his first day on the job. To the world outside, it was simply a new employee joining a prestigious company. But for Thomas, this day was the culmination of years of effort, sacrifice, and resilience. Dressed sharply in a fitted suit and holding a firm resolve in his step, Thomas's heart carried a quiet confidence. Though he was new to this role, there was an assurance within him, a calm strength that some might interpret as arrogance, but which, in truth, was born from a deeper place. But Thomas's appearance was only one part of the story. As Thomas entered, his gaze met the office manager's, Mr. Carlton. For those who worked at Westwick Solutions, Mr. Carlton was the essence of authority. Known for his piercing gaze, Mr. Carlton was the type of man who expected nothing less than unwavering respect. He was the one who set the tone, the gatekeeper who ensured that hierarchy remained untouched. And to him, Thomas was just another new face, an outsider who needed to be shown his place. Yet what neither Thomas nor Mr. Carlton knew was that their lives would soon intertwine in ways neither could foresee. The first day played out as it usually does in any corporate office. Introductions, a tour of the workspace, the hum of computers, the shuffle of papers. Yet within the quiet shuffle and the polite greetings, tension began to grow. Mr. Carlton's attitude toward Thomas was not just cold, it was almost dismissive. While Thomas introduced himself to others with a friendly handshake and easy smile, Carlton's responses were clipped, his gaze lingering just a moment too long, as if calculating something. As the weeks wore on, the dynamic between Thomas and Mr. Carlton only grew more complicated. It wasn't overt at first, nothing that could be easily pinpointed or even openly challenged. Small things, the kind that might go unnoticed to anyone looking from the outside, began to emerge. Thomas would offer suggestions in meetings, ideas that were promptly ignored or overshadowed by Carlton's interruptions. Tasks were assigned to him that seemed irrelevant or beneath his qualifications. On more than one occasion, Carlton's voice held a tone of condescension as he spoke, a subtle belittling that only those with a keen ear might detect. To many, this would be nothing more than typical workplace dynamics. But there was something else beneath the surface, an almost unspoken hostility that could be felt in the way Carlton moved around Thomas, the dismissive glances he threw, and the coldness that seemed to emanate from him whenever Thomas was present. But through it all, Thomas remained unfazed. He carried on, composed and undeterred, as if he knew something no one else did. His calm was both his strength and his shield, a quiet defiance against Carlton's subtle insults. The way he handled himself was noticed by others, yet no one dared to voice their thoughts. But Thomas's calm demeanor, his silent resilience, didn't go unnoticed by everyone. There were whispers in the office, small murmurs passed between employees over coffee breaks, or exchanged in hushed voices in the halls. Many speculated why Thomas hadn't reacted, hadn't pushed back, or filed a complaint. In truth, Thomas's silence was part of something greater. He had come here for a reason, a purpose far deeper than anyone could imagine. And soon that purpose would reveal itself. It was a cold, gray morning when Thomas first stepped through the towering doors of Westwick Solutions. The city, shrouded in mist, seemed to exhale a chill that seeped into the bones. Inside the building, the atmosphere was charged not with excitement, but with a kind of quiet intensity that you could feel in the way people moved, spoke, and even looked at each other. This was a place where ambition was currency, and status was worn like armor. But today something was different. Today a new player had entered the game. Thomas was no stranger to first days. He'd spent years navigating spaces like these, places where people's worth was measured by the firmness of their handshake or the titles on their business cards. But there was something different about this moment, something that made him pause just a fraction longer before crossing the lobby. His stride was confident, his face calm, yet there was an unmistakable glint in his eye. To anyone watching, he appeared composed, self-assured, a man prepared to make his mark. As he entered the open office floor, heads turned, subtle glances were exchanged, quiet murmurs whispered between cubicles. It was subtle. The kind of attention that people give to someone new, a silent evaluation, sizing up the newcomer. But Thomas remained unaffected, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. It was as if he were taking in the whole room, silently observing every face, every reaction, every subtle shift of body language. And then, his gaze met that of Mr. Carlton. Mr. Carlton was a fixture at Westwick Solutions. A man of unspoken authority, he was known for his cool, clinical approach to managing people. Dressed immaculately, his gaze sharp and unwavering, Carlton had a way of making others feel small without saying a word. For him, power lay in control and maintaining a distance that kept him untouchable, unreachable. To him, Thomas was just another employee, a subordinate to be shaped, molded, and ultimately kept in line. And yet, from the very first moment, there was something about Thomas that Carlton couldn't quite place. The introductions were brief, formal, almost clinical. Carlton extended a hand, his grip firm but devoid of warmth. Thomas, in turn, met it with an equal steadiness, a faint smile barely touching his lips. For a moment, the two stood there in silence, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. There was a look in Carlton's eyes, a slight narrowing, a flicker of something like doubt. But just as quickly it was gone, replaced by a look of indifference. Carlton spoke in a clipped tone, nodding toward a row of cubicles. "This is where you'll be working," he said, with the faintest hint of condescension. For most, this might have been the end of it, a simple first interaction on a first day. But as Thomas moved toward his new desk, a quiet murmur started to build among the employees. They had seen this before. They knew Carlton's ways, knew that his coolness was often more than just a professional distance. His tone, his looks, the slight raise of his brow, all were signs, subtle cues that he'd already made up his mind about the newcomer. And yet, there was something about Thomas that was different. As the day went on, the office continued to buzz with its usual rhythm: phone calls, the hum of printers, the click of heels across the floor. But beneath it all was an awareness, a sense that something else was in motion. As the hours passed, Thomas observed everything: the way Carlton's gaze lingered just a second longer when he passed by his desk, the way coworkers seemed to instinctively look down or away whenever Carlton was near. And though Thomas didn't react, there was a quiet resolve in his movements, as if he were simply waiting for something. The first day unfolded like a carefully orchestrated performance. Carlton moved with his usual air of authority, delivering quick orders, making his presence known. To anyone watching, it might have seemed routine, even mundane. But if you looked closer, there was a tension of friction that couldn't be ignored. Thomas's quiet resilience, his calm acceptance of every task given, was both unassuming and defiant. And while others may not have noticed, Carlton certainly did. But what the office didn't realize was that beneath Thomas's quiet exterior lay a purpose, a determination that went beyond simple ambition. He wasn't here to just blend in, to follow orders, or fit into the mold that Carlton had set for him. No, Thomas's presence was something far more deliberate. He was there for a reason that neither Carlton nor the rest of Westwick Solutions could yet see. And so, as the first day came to an end, Thomas left the building, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors, a faint smile touching his lips as he walked out into the darkening city. As the days unfolded, the corridors of Westwick Solutions became something of an unspoken battlefield, though no one dared say it outright. Mr. Carlton's disdain wasn't obvious to everyone. It was masked behind a practiced demeanor, hidden in the smallest gestures, the quickest glances, and the silence that followed Thomas wherever he went. To most, Mr. Carlton's cool, indifferent behavior seemed a product of his rank, a trait of a seasoned manager holding authority over a new hire. But to Thomas it was something different. It was clear, even from the beginning, that Carlton's regard for him was laced with something else, something unspoken, simmering beneath a polished exterior. Each meeting began to carry an unspoken tension. Carlton would watch Thomas closely, his eyes narrowing whenever he raised a point or offered a suggestion. It was as if he was waiting for Thomas to make a mistake, to slip up, to show some sign of weakness. But Thomas never faltered. His responses were measured, his demeanor calm. And for Carlton, this composure seemed only to deepen the resentment. Whenever Thomas spoke, Carlton was quick to cut in, dismissing his input with an impatient wave, rolling his eyes with a thinly veiled sneer, or outright ignoring his words altogether. But Carlton's behavior didn't stop at meetings. In the hallways, where words could be spoken just low enough to avoid the ears of others, Carlton would assign Thomas tasks that bordered on the trivial, mundane errands meant for someone far below his position. He would delegate menial assignments, tasks that had no purpose but to belittle. Filing papers, fetching coffee, moving files that didn't need moving. Each task was like a message, a reminder of Carlton's authority, and a signal to Thomas of where he supposedly belonged. And yet, Thomas never showed a trace of resentment, not a flicker of anger. He went about each task with the same quiet dignity, the same composed look that he had held on his first day. Each time Carlton attempted to strip away his confidence, to remind him of his place, Thomas responded with a simple nod, a courteous smile, or sometimes nothing at all. It was as though each dismissive task only served to strengthen him, his silence becoming a language of its own, one that Carlton was beginning to understand and resent. The other employees could sense it too. Whispers circulated in hushed tones, snatches of conversation held over coffee, exchanged in quick glances. They saw how Carlton's mood would shift whenever Thomas entered a room, the subtle downturn of his mouth, the barely contained impatience. They saw how Carlton would assign Thomas the tasks no one else wanted, and how Thomas would complete each one without a word of complaint. But there was something in Thomas's silence that unsettled them all. It was as if he knew more than he let on, as if he was merely biding his time. Every time Carlton dismissed him, every time he issued one of his carefully crafted insults or directed him toward a menial task, Thomas would simply nod, his face an impenetrable mask. His silence, so calm, so steady, was unnerving. Carlton had expected him to show irritation, frustration, perhaps even anger. But instead, Thomas remained unshaken, his patience both a strength and a statement. This only seemed to agitate Carlton further, his irritation growing with each silent exchange. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Carlton's actions became sharper, more deliberate. The tasks became more demeaning, the tone more biting. It was as if he were trying to provoke a reaction, to draw out some emotion that Thomas refused to show. But Thomas would simply look him in the eye, his gaze steady, almost amused, and then carry on with whatever he was asked to do. To the casual observer, these exchanges were nothing out of the ordinary, but to those who paid close attention, they were a battle, a silent war between pride and patience, between power and restraint. And as the days passed, the tension grew heavier, thicker. It was no longer simply an issue of authority, it was a matter of control. Carlton, who had always ruled his office with unchallenged command, found himself faced with someone he couldn't bend, someone he couldn't shape into the role he had chosen for him. Thomas's patience, his silent resilience, became a thorn in his side, a constant reminder that his authority, his control, was being tested. And though no one dared speak it aloud, they could all feel it, the quiet resistance that Thomas wore like armor. There were moments when Carlton would stop in his tracks, staring at Thomas from across the room, as if trying to read him, to see something he might have missed. He had dealt with resistance before, with employees who challenged him, but Thomas was different. He wasn't challenging Carlton outright, and that only made his presence more unsettling. His silence was not an act of defiance, but it was something stronger, something that Carlton could neither understand nor control. It was an unknown, a quiet mystery that gnawed at him with each passing day. As the days stretched into weeks, Mr. Carlton's behavior took on a new intensity. What had begun as dismissive glances and trivial tasks soon evolved into something sharper, something more pointed. Carlton was no longer merely tolerating Thomas's presence, he was now actively working to undermine it. In meetings, Carlton would stand at the head of the table, chest out, chin high, a smug certainty settled across his features. To him, each word he spoke, each directive he gave, was a testament to his authority, a declaration of his so-called leadership and vision. He seemed to believe that his place at the helm of Westwick Solutions was as natural as the rising sun, unquestionable, and, to his mind, fully deserved. Carlton spoke often of his accomplishments, reminding those around him of the success he'd supposedly built from the ground up. He would boast of his leadership journey, of how his vision had brought prosperity to the company, as if he alone were responsible for its success. His voice would carry through the room, each word carefully selected to establish his dominance, each glance a reminder of his authority. And yet there, seated at the far end of the table, Thomas watched with an expression of quiet calm, his gaze unwavering, his posture resolute. The other employees could sense the shift in the room. The way Carlton's voice seemed to swell as he spoke, filling the space with his ego. But as he looked at Thomas, something in his expression grew harder, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Carlton was no longer content to simply ignore or dismiss Thomas. He was now actively working to demean him. Every subtle insult, every slight glance, every condescending comment was delivered with the precision of someone who wanted to break his opponent, to force them into submission. In one meeting, Carlton went further than he had before. Standing before the group, he directed his comments squarely at Thomas, his tone dripping with disdain. "You're still new here," he said, barely concealing the sneer in his voice. "And there's a lot for you to learn about this company, about your role." His words were sharp, calculated, meant to cut. Around the table, a tense silence fell, the other employees shifting uneasily in their chairs. They exchanged glances, some of pity, others of discomfort, as Carlton's words hung heavy in the air. Carlton continued, undeterred by the silence that followed his remarks. He straightened, folded his arms, and looked down at Thomas with a faint smirk, as though daring him to respond, to show some sign of discomfort or defeat. But Thomas did nothing of the sort. He met Carlton's gaze head-on, his expression one of quiet defiance, his silence speaking louder than words. In that moment, it was as if the room itself held its breath, waiting, anticipating what might happen next. Carlton's face flickered just for a moment, with something akin to confusion, and perhaps for the briefest instant he realized that his words, his attempts to belittle Thomas, had failed to make any impact. But Carlton was not a man to admit defeat so easily. In the days that followed, his behavior grew even more pronounced, his condescension more deliberate. He would pull Thomas aside in the hallways, his voice low, words laced with venom. He assigned Thomas tasks that had no real purpose, responsibilities that no one else would take on. He spoke to him as though he were a child, reminding him to stay in line and to remember his place. To the casual observer, these interactions might have seemed trivial, insignificant. But to those who paid attention, they were anything but.
In private moments when Carlton believed no one was watching, his arrogance would resurface, unchecked. He would make grand statements about the future of Westwick Solutions, talking about how his leadership would guide the company into greatness. He spoke as if he alone held the reins, as if his word was the only one that mattered. Employees would listen, nodding in compliance, but there were glances small, wary looks exchanged among them, hints of doubt and unease. For while Carlton believed he was unchallenged, others were beginning to see the cracks in his authority. And still, Thomas remained calm. He carried out his tasks, attended meetings, listened to Carlton's remarks, all with a steady, unflinching resolve. His silence had become its own form of power, an invisible force that seemed to unsettle Carlton even more than words ever could. In each interaction, each dismissive task, there was a quiet defiance, an unspoken confidence that hinted at something just beyond the surface. It was as if Thomas were waiting for the right moment, a moment that only he knew was coming.
The day began like any other. Employees filed into the boardroom, taking their seats around the large table, a quiet hum of chatter filling the air. At the head of the table stood Carlton, poised and confident as always. He glanced around the room with a look of controlled satisfaction, believing that he, as usual, was in charge of this meeting. Little did he know, today would be different. Today, his world, so meticulously curated and firmly controlled, was about to shift in a way he never saw coming. Carlton began as he always did, his voice filling the room with the well-rehearsed authority of a man who believed himself to be untouchable. He spoke of the company's future, of the important steps they were about to take on a new project, positioning himself as the guiding force behind every decision. But there was something different in the air, something unspoken, an undercurrent that seemed to ripple through the room. And at the center of it all was Thomas, seated quietly, waiting, his gaze fixed calmly on Carlton. As Carlton continued, he didn't notice the way the room had begun to shift. His words, usually received with silent nods and polite agreement, now seemed to fall flat, meeting blank stares and glances exchanged between colleagues. They could sense something even if they couldn't yet put it into words. They could feel the subtle tension, the anticipation building. Carlton, however, remained oblivious, lost in his own voice, unaware of the quiet storm gathering at the far end of the table. Then, finally, the moment came. Carlton, eager to end the meeting with his usual flourish, announced that he would be leading the new project, reminding everyone that he was the one with the vision to take them forward. And in that instant, Thomas stood up. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to him as he rose slowly, calmly, a faint, polite smile touching his lips. He looked around the table, meeting the gazes of his colleagues, and then, finally, his eyes settled on Carlton. And then, in a voice that was steady, almost gentle, Thomas spoke. "Actually, I'll be leading this from now on." The words were simple, almost understated, but they landed with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Carlton's face froze, his eyes widening, the mask of control slipping away as the reality of what had just been said began to sink in. He stared at Thomas, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came. For once, Carlton was speechless. The room held its breath, a stunned silence filling the space. And in that silence, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. Carlton, who had once ruled this room with his presence alone, now seemed smaller, diminished, as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. He looked at Thomas as though seeing him for the first time, as though he were trying to piece together a puzzle that had suddenly changed shape before his very eyes. Thomas continued, his voice calm, his words measured. "I believe we'll be taking the company in a new direction," he said, each word landing like a quiet declaration. There was no gloating, no anger, only a quiet confidence, a sense of purpose that needed no embellishment. His gaze never left Carlton's, and in that gaze was a message, a silent acknowledgement of every slight, every dismissal, every moment of condescension that Carlton had thrown his way. And now, with a few simple words, Thomas had taken back the power Carlton had so desperately tried to hold over him. The silence that followed was almost deafening. It was as though the air itself had changed, as though something fundamental in the room had shifted, leaving everyone in a stunned, almost reverent silence. Carlton, still sitting, seemed frozen, his hands clenched as he fought to regain his composure. But it was clear to everyone his reign was over. The power he had once held so tightly was now firmly in Thomas's hands. And as Thomas stood there, looking around the room, there was a quiet understanding in the eyes of his colleagues, a recognition of the new reality that had just been established. The air in the boardroom was different now, charged with a quiet reverence that had never been felt before. A new kind of authority had settled into place, not one that demanded power, but one that commanded respect. Thomas, standing at the head of the table, exuded a calm confidence that was unspoken yet undeniable. His colleagues watched him closely, their expressions thoughtful, their gazes steady. As they listened to this new leader, this man they thought they knew, but had, perhaps only now, truly seen for the first time. And then, in that quiet, Thomas began to speak. There was no need for grand gestures or flowery language. His words were measured, simple, yet profound. He outlined his vision for the company, one that was built not on hierarchy or control, but on respect and unity. He spoke of a workplace where every voice could be heard, where contributions would be valued, regardless of rank or title. His voice carried through the room with a quiet strength, a sense of conviction that resonated with every person listening. At the far end of the table, Carlton sat in silence, his gaze fixed downward, hands folded tightly in his lap. The man who had once wielded power with an iron grip now seemed smaller, subdued, his once imposing presence all but dissolved. He listened, but this time his silence held no trace of authority, no lingering hints of superiority. He listened not out of necessity, but out of humility, and perhaps even a measure of regret. As Thomas spoke of change, of progress, of a new direction for the company, a palpable shift swept through the room. For years, many had simply accepted the status quo, believing that this was the only way things could be. But now, under Thomas's calm authority, they began to see another path, a workplace built on values, a culture founded on respect. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing possibilities they hadn't dared to imagine. And then, in one quiet but unmistakable gesture, Carlton rose from his seat. He looked around the room, his eyes momentarily meeting Thomas's. There was no anger, no resentment, only a kind of silent acknowledgement. Without a word, he turned and walked to the door, his footsteps echoing softly in the silence. As he exited, the atmosphere seemed to lighten, as though the weight of his presence had finally lifted, leaving behind a space that was open, unencumbered, and ready for something new. With Carlton gone, the team turned back to Thomas, their expressions reflecting a unified resolve. They were ready for change, ready to move forward, and Thomas, in his understated way, had given them that path. As he looked around the table, a subtle smile touched his lips, a smile not of victory, but of quiet fulfillment, a recognition of the journey that had brought him here. He knew that this was only the beginning. As the meeting concluded, Thomas closed his laptop and stood by the window, looking out over the city below. The sun was breaking through the clouds, casting light onto the buildings, illuminating the glass in a way that felt almost symbolic. This was a new chapter, not just for him, but for everyone at Westwick Solutions. And as he looked out, he knew that true power didn't lie in titles or authority, but in the respect and trust of those around him. In the end, power doesn't reside in titles. It lies in how you treat others, in the respect you show to those who work beside you. Because in life, respect will always find its way back to you.